Hi, and welcome to this episode of John's Motorcycle Rescue and Review. In this video, we're going to take a look at each of the leader bikes that Suzuki produced during the 1980s. As I was going through my photo album recently, I realized that I have owned or ridden every model of leader bike that Suzuki produced during the 1980s. I thought this would be a fun video to do where I could give a brief riding description of each of the bikes. There are 3 leader bikes that I'm not including in this list, and those are the Suzuki GS1100 GK touring bike, the Suzuki 1400 Cavalcade, and the Suzuki Intruder 1400. We'll start off this list with the 2-valve per cylinder motorcycles that Suzuki produced in the early 80s. The first bike on this list is the iconic 1978 GS1100E. I know this is technically a 70s bike, but it was still in production in the 80s as the GS1000S. And the GS1000S was essentially the same motorcycle with a small sport fairing on it and a different instrument cluster. I purchased this bike from a friend as an all-stock bike, and I put a lower handlebar on it, I put the Kirker exhaust on it, and I painted the lower fork tubes black. And I really like the way that all of those mods kind of went together with the look of the bike. The GS1000E was really a game changer when it was introduced because it was the first big bore Japanese bike to really handle well. And it was also a very quick bike, and it did very well in bracket racing. It had a very strong motor in it. And my memory of the bike, I thought it handled very nicely. I rode it quite a bit. My only complaint with it was the seat foam I felt was a little bit too tall, and it somewhat limited the feel for me for the rear end of the bike. And I don't know why that impression sticks with me, but other than that, it was just a really neat handling bike, and it's one that I wouldn't mind having in the garage again. The next bike on this list is another bike that debuted in the late 70s but was still in production in the early 80s by Suzuki, and that is the GS1000G. My GS1000G was an all-stock example. It was the black and gold model. And it was just a great driving, everyday driver. It handled very well, very, very similarly to the GS1000E. And in fact, there were a lot of similarities between the two bikes. The E model had the advantage in all-out performance, but in everyday riding, the bikes were so similar that you would have a hard time telling them apart from the saddle. The one aspect of the shaft drive Suzukis that I appreciate is that the shaft drive did not degrade the handling of the standard style bikes. And so you got the benefits of having a shaft drive with its low maintenance and its cleaner operating, but you didn't have the traditional drawbacks of those. The next bike on the list is the 1982 GS1100G, and it featured some real improvements over the GS1000G. First off, the motor and the low-end power of the 1100 motor was significantly more stout. Another area that received some upgrades were the beefier fork tubes on the GS1100G, and I feel like that gave it much better front-end feel. On this particular bike, I've done some suspension modifications in the front and the back and really firmed up the suspension. And with the modifications that I've done, this bike is just a great everyday driver super bike. It's one of my favorite bikes that I've ever owned, and I plan on keeping it for a long, long time. It rides nice, it handles nice, it's got great low-end streetable power, and it's just a fun machine. The last of the 2-valve bikes that we'll cover is the GS1100L. The 1100L started off in the 80s as the GS1000L, and it looked very similar. The bodywork was exactly the same, the seat was the same. But in 1982, they bumped the displacement on the motor up to 1100 cc's, and it really gave the bike a lot more low-end power. Even though this bike looks like a cruiser, it actually handles incredibly well. It's a very nimble bike, especially if you changed out the handlebars as I've done on mine. It's the kind of bike that you can ride slowly, and it's very happy doing that. It doesn't pressure you to go fast, but when you want to open it up, it has all sorts of performance on tap. Moving on to the 16-valve Suzukis. In 1980, Suzuki introduced the 16-valve twin-swirl combustion chamber heads for their superbikes, and the 1980 through 81 GS1100 was the best of the best in the superbikes of the early 80s. This was really the bike that put the CBX on the trailer. It was a better performing bike in straight line speed. It handled much better, and it was so much more simple and easy to maintain and easy to live with than the CBX. And it was just a good all-around real-world superbike. I picked this bike up recently and I've gone through it and I've done more of a light mechanical restoration on it, but I can honestly say this is one of my favorite Suzukis that I've ever ridden. Compared to the other Suzuki leader bikes and even the later GS1100E, the 80 and 81 versions had a very compact seating position, and it had you sitting somewhat close to the front end of the bike, so it doesn't have a real stretch to the bars, even with lower bars, and it also has nice leg room. And this bike flat out handles awesome in the corners. It makes very nice smooth power from that 16 valve motor. It's got the slick shifting 5-speed. For me, this is probably my favorite riding GS that I've ever owned. The ultimate GS1100E was the 1983 model, and although it looked identical to the 1982 model, it featured a host of improvements in the internals of the engine, including welded crank pins. It also had more valve lift and longer duration cams, and that gave it substantially more power in the bottom end without sacrificing power in the top end. It's a very quick bike. It's a bike that can clock off a quarter-mile time in the high 10-second range. Combined with that, it's a very comfortable bike. It handles very well, and I really do like the styling on the 83, in particular with the blacked out engine and the black exhaust. It does have noticeably more low-end power than my 1981 GS1100E, and it's a bike that is just really fun to drive quickly on a tighter back road. Very nice machine and one of the ultimate UJMs. One of the more unique Suzukis I've owned was the first year SZ100 Katana. This bike also featured the 16 valve twin swirl combustion chamber heads, but the motor displacement was kept to 996 cc's for production racing. The Katana had that unique styling. It was also very radical in the seating position. It had very limited legroom. Your feet were set high and far back. In addition to the high foot pegs, it had very low set clip-on handlebars that seemed like they were a mile away from the seat. It was a neat bike. It ran great. It was a quick bike, but the suspension on it was very harsh. And the seating position was such that you felt like you had been shoved in a trash can butt first. I probably should have kept the Katana for collectability reasons. It's a really cool bike to look at, but I don't miss riding it. And that brings us to the next bike on the list, and that is Suzuki's GS1150ES. The 1150ES was the successor to the GS1100E. It featured a larger displacement motor, and this bike was one of the king of the quick bikes when it debuted. And with Pee Wee J. Gleason on board, it actually clocked off a 10.4 second quarter mile, which is scaldingly fast. I thought the 1150ES was a nice looking bike. My riding impressions of the 1150ES are mixed. It was a quick bike. It was a comfortable bike, but it was very buzzy. I had a lot of engine vibration on mine. I also got a ton of turbulence coming over the windscreen, and it was almost deafening to ride. Another thing that I didn't really care for on the 1150ES was the anti-dive, and it was prone to locking the front wheel under heavy braking if you hit any kind of bump or undulation in the pavement. And I actually put my bike down coming up to a stoplight where there were some truck ripples in the pavement. The front wheel locked up and the bike went right out from under me. The 1150E was also prone to clutch basket issues. When I got mine, the clutch basket was already loose on the rivets, and so that needed to be welded. Mine also suffered from front brake warping. So my overall experience with the 1150ES was not as good as it had been with a lot of my other Suzuki GS bikes. The next bike in the lineup here is a real oddball. It is Suzuki's Madura 1200. And this is a bike that not a lot of people know about. In fact, when I purchased mine, I hadn't heard of the bike before. It was a bike that was designed by Suzuki to compete with the V65 Magna and the VMAX and the Eliminator from Kawasaki. It features a 1200cc liquid-cooled V4 engine. It was a 16-valve motor with hydraulic valve actuation. It also had a 6-speed transmission and shaft final drive. very much in line with the other muscle cruisers of the time. My impression of the Madura was, it's probably the ugliest bike that I've ever owned. I wasn't a fan of the styling, but as far as the muscle cruisers go, and I have owned them all, I thought the Madura made the best daily driver of the bunch. It actually handled very nicely, it rode very nicely, it was plenty quick enough with the big V4 in it, and it was really a pleasant place to be. Next up is Suzuki's iconic GSX-R1100. No list of big bore 1980 Suzukis would be complete without this machine. It's hard to imagine the impact that this bike had in today's world where we're used to very hardcore sport bikes. But in the mid-80s, most of the big bore sport bikes were also really good street bikes. So they were bikes that were meant to be driven on the road. They did not really have racetrack aspirations, although you could certainly do a track day on most of them. The GSXR1100 was literally a race bike with lights. The GSXR1100 featured a new from the ground up 1100cc inline 4-cylinder motor. It was air and oil cooled. It featured 4 valves per cylinder, and it had a plain bearing crank instead of the roller bearing crank that the previous GS motorcycles had used. This new motor was mated to a slick shifting 5-speed transmission, and subsequent years have shown this motor to be incredibly robust, able to handle lots of modifications, and very, very reliable. If you look at the bike, really the lights, the mirrors, and the turn signals are the only concessions to street use that you'll find on the machine. My friend had one of these in the early 90s, and I was able to ride his. And when I rode it, I was just shocked by how raw the bike was. It vibrated a lot, it was uncomfortable, but it was lightweight. It did handle very, very well. It had really nice brakes for the time period that it was introduced. And it was really the first of the very, very hardcore sport bikes. Looking at the instruments, you can see there are no covers to hide the inside of the fairing. And this was just a minimalist race bike with lights. And that was the beauty of it. And it was also the downfall of it. It didn't really make a good street bike, but man, was it sexy. And that brings us to the final Suzuki in this list, and that is the Katana 1100 of the late 80s. This bike had a version of the GSXR 1100 air and oil cooled motor. It also featured a steel perimeter frame, but this was more of a sport touring bike, very much along the lines of Yamaha's FJ1200. When you rode the Katana, it felt somewhat long and low. It had very nice low end power. My Katana 1100 had a Yosh pipe. The Katana also featured a front windshield that you could raise or lower electrically. That was kind of a neat feature. And you could raise the windshield up on cool days and it would give you a little bit more wind protection. The handling on the Katana was fairly neutral. It was an easy bike to ride, and the power and the sound and the comfort really made it a joy to ride. Alright, well this video ended up a little bit longer than I anticipated. If you have a favorite bike out of this group that you really like, please let me know in the comment section below. As always, I hope you found this video entertaining and informative, and until next time, enjoy the ride.